I want to thank you all for giving up an hour of your day to join us today to talk about managing remote workers. This is a topic that, obviously is important to all of us, and we're glad to have you here to participate. So my name is Diane Rollman. I'm a professor in occupational and environmental health in our College of Public Health. And I want to introduce Beth Livingston, who is a faculty member in the Tippie College of Business. And we've been working together to look at the University of Iowa and how COVID has impacted our well-being. And this partnership has led to this webinar there. So I am part of the Healthier Workforce Center of the Midwest, which is a federally funded center focused on protecting safety and health of our workers, but also building well-being among workers. And we've now reached out and are partnering with colleagues in Tippie College of Business, and that's been an exciting partnership which moves us in a new direction there. So one of the activities that we have been involved in, and you might recognize my name because I've sent out a couple of emails, is a University of Iowa Employee Wellbeing Survey. And this was a survey that we've now done 2 waves of. The first wave was in May and June. We did a second one in August, and we planned 2 more in November and February. But we wanted to start off by giving you a little bit of information about what we found about this survey. First of all, what we were interested in is what impact has COVID had on the well-being of University of Iowa employees. And overall, it's had a negative impact. We've seen a decrease in well-being due to COVID-19 among all employee groups, all faculty, staff, and postdoc that replied. However, not surprisingly, we know it's our on-site clinical workers that are reporting the lowest overall well-being. And that's an important group, and we want to make sure those essential workers have the needs that are, their needs addressed and resources available to them. One of the other interesting things we found was that younger employees are experiencing the worst health and well-being outcomes compared to any other age group. And that's something we need to think about as supervisors. We also know that leadership is critical during a crisis. We found that employees whose supervisors support their family roles report lower stress and well-being. Likewise, remote supervisors who are confident and empowering also report better well-being outcomes. And we found that among the supervisors that were managing remote workers, well-being, anxiety, and depression were areas of concern. And we found higher anxiety among these supervisors that was associated with a lack of confidence in delivering effective feedback remotely, checking in with employees remotely, or being able to set expectations there. So this led us to reach out to the experts here at the University of Iowa to talk about these issues. So let's meet those experts now. We have an all-star lineup today. I'm really excited. We have Amy Kulper, who is a professor of management and entrepreneurship. We have Sean Hesler, Director of Learning and Development. I feel like you guys should run through the UI, football thing. Joe Hetrick, Associate Director of ITS and Research Services. Teresa Kulper, Senior UHR Lead and Organizational Effectiveness. And Marcus Seaton, Director of Workers' Compensation in the University of Iowa Ergonomics. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Livingston, and she will get this panel started.
Thank you, Diane. I am so happy. I would normally say I'm so happy to see your lovely faces, but I can't see your faces. So I'll just say I'm so happy to see your lovely names and phone numbers that have popped up on our attendees list. We're very excited to be able to bring this wonderful all-star panel, like Diane said, to you guys today. My goal for this session and our goal for this session is for you guys to be able to take some big picture ideas that you can sit with and chew on for a little bit, to think about your own approaches in the future, but also to take away some very specific examples and ideas and activities that you can put into play right away. And so we're going to be having the panelists answer a few questions and share some of their experiences. If you have questions for the panelists, feel free to use the chat to do that. I will be coming back to the chat towards the end of today's session to ask some of those questions. But I also want to thank all of you guys for being so responsive in the registration survey, because you gave us some really great things to think about. And we actually used your very words to plan our approach for today's webinar, where we used your words. We coded, I coded the responses based on what Diane and I felt were the most thematic issues that our attendees had brought up. And we came up with essentially 5 themes that it seemed like you guys were really interested in learning more about. And so the first one was how to engage employees better. How do I engage in this remote atmosphere? The second was how do I encourage productivity, assess productivity, monitor productivity amongst my remote employees? And the third is how do I see warning signs? Like, how do I know something isn't going quite right? The fourth theme that popped up was how do I maintain connections? When I had an in-person team, for instance, I might have had a number of different things that I would put into play to connect with my employees, and now I can't do those things. So what do I do in this environment? And the fifth thing that emerged was how do I give performance feedback, which is a very specific sort of HR type of function, but incredibly important to the long-term performance of our employees and their longevity with our organization. And so those are the 5 things that popped up in your responses, and we're going to try to address the majority of those themes in our questions today. So I want to thank our panel. I'm going to jump right into questions so you can hear from them, because I know that hearing from them is what you're here to do. So we are going to pop in and answer some questions or ask some questions now. So I'm going to go around and ask all of our panelists the same questions, and we're going to start with this one. So one of the major themes, I think the plurality of you brought up, how do you engage remote staff? Like, how do I do these sorts of things? And so I want to ask the panelists, each of you, can you give some examples of how you've engaged your remote staff and also whether it worked or not? Because sometimes we try things and they don't exactly work the way we wanted them to. And I think we'd like to hear both your successes and the things that maybe weren't quite as successful. So I'm going to start with Sean, if you could tell us a little bit about what you've done to engage remote staff.
Sure. So we've done some of the probably more common and popular things like virtual coffee breaks or happy hours. We've also had some opportunities. We had somebody who graduated from a master's program, and so we made sure to celebrate that, as well as birthday celebrations. One thing that I have been doing, because I felt like I was not as in touch if I was maintaining my previous meeting schedule, I started having more frequent meetings with my team, but shorter. So I was trying to conserve some calendar space for everybody, but I needed to meet with them a little more often. I've also changed the way that we're having conversations in our one-on-one meetings. So we're still doing a lot of work stuff, of course, but I'm also asking questions like, how's the remote schedule working for you? How's the technology holding up? What things are going well? What are you binge watching? Since people are at home more, it does make sense to me that we want to ask more questions about what's going on in their home life. And so to the extent that I feel comfortable and that I sense that they're comfortable, I do ask questions about, what they're binge watching, what kinds of home projects they're working on and things like that. And I have found that it's helped me feel more in touch, and they seem to appreciate it as well.
Nice. Joe, would you like to share some of the things you've done?
Yeah, I think I agree with Sean. One of the things that I also did early on was adjust our meetings to be to have some virtual walking time. I found that actually really helpful for me, because as a person who sits in a lot of meetings, having that back to back was really challenging. I think that was useful for staff. I also feel that changing the type of engagements away from strictly sort of operational work related and having more conversation about how they're doing, what's bothering them, that really helped create a connection so that we could have more conversations later. And it really made this is a stressful time for everyone. And so keeping that in mind, I think it was more important than getting the work done, especially early on. One of the things that our team had done previously, but we really did a lot more, is more asynchronous communication. So rather than having meetings that were one-on-one in Zoom or as a group in Zoom, we would do a lot of outside communication. So we use a ticketing system, and we would have conversations in there and sort of tee up either projects or even conversations about how we were going to go remote. So what things we need to keep in mind when we were going to be off campus. And that helped us come to decision more quickly when we came to have a Zoom meeting where people were a little bit unsettled. And it made us, we didn't have as many meetings because we we had 80% of the conversation offline and at people's own pace based on, how they were working around family or whatever. I also did a lot of micro polls with my team. So when we would have our team meetings, I think it might have become a little bit of a joke, but I would kind of pop up these little 1 or 2 question Zoom polls. And they were, well-being. I asked things to kind of validate things I was hearing from other groups or other managers, and just to kind of get a feel for where that was. And I think that also helped create a space where we could have more conversation later, either as a group or individually. And I think those are successful. I see some people in the chat asking about the socials. We did do those, and I felt those are mixed, right? For some people, those are a fun thing, and for other people, it's just another Zoom meeting. So I had mixed success. For some people, I think it was a really good thing, and for others, it's not something. It's something they could take or leave.
Yeah, and Joe, just a quick question before we move to Teresa. I want to ask about some of those things. Just specifically, did you use polls in Zoom and ask questions? And then did you use, so in your kind of offline, I know you guys use a ticketing system, right, to be able to do that, but similar to kind of like a message board or something that is, asynchronous communication. So you can just go on and post, and that's correct?
Yeah, we use a tool called Slack, which is sort of like Teams, where we can kind of, chat, real-time chat, but that's sort of a non-interruptive way for people to converse. And really, it was important to try to make sure that we had some newer staff, and so keeping the team together. We hired a student in the middle of the pandemic, and sort of onboarding these people and getting them comfortable. And we also, in other areas, we use Teams. So, the ability to sort of attach documents and work through a process sort of asynchronous. So we use the tools that were already there to do that.
Thank you, Joe. Teresa, would you like to add what you've done to engage your staff?
Sure. I think it's almost tying together a couple of things that were said. I think early on, especially when I think about all of university HR, our whole area, like 100 people, we did start doing like weekly listening posts right off the bat. And a lot of that was operational. To Joe's point, at first it's just like, but people were really hungry for information, and we needed everybody to hear it together at the same time. So it started out pretty tactical, pretty operational, but we realized right away that social interaction at that point when everybody's together is really, really helpful. So again, the polls and breakout rooms and things like that to try and increase interaction, we felt like that was really successful. I might elaborate a little bit on the happy hour that Sean was talking about, which, by the way, was after hours. I think our drug-free work policy, no, okay, I won't go there. How did we get people there? Well, we just invited them, right? And people brought their dogs, they brought their spouses, there were a couple of kids there. And I think that informal nature really encouraged participation. People were excited because we used to have these kinds of parties. So whenever we can think about what it used to look like when we were in the office, right? And we had all these cubes and you could stop in and say, hey, how'd that vet appointment turn out, or something like that. If we can build those into what exists, it really helps people keep connected and engaged.
And I think that you're hearing these sorts of ways is finding ways to do things synchronously plus asynchronously, but also everybody's different in terms of what they need. And you guys are trying to figure out what your teams need in those moments.
Mm-hmm. And if they don't want to come to the social, that's okay too, right? That might be just, okay, I've had it and it's after hours and I want to go do what I do after hours.
Awesome. Great. Marcus, would you like to share?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback onto Teresa's point of making things closer to what it was in office. So one thing that I was doing wrong that I'll share with everybody in my viewpoint was emailing people to let them know that I'm going to give them a call to have a discussion, which seemed appropriate at the time, but when you think about, that's not how things work in the office. So now whether they know it or not, I've adopted more of a schedule where I'll either shoot them my IM and have a chat informally, or just simply pick up the phone, which seems novel in this day and age, but to have a direct discussion without having something formally surrounding it. So just being more informal about, just like Teresa says, if I would just be stopping by their cube to have a discussion.
I like that, like thinking through, I feel like the added logistical time and challenges that, really can go underappreciated. I think everybody, particularly if you're working remotely, there's this idea that it's less work, but I think in a lot of ways it's more work because of those logistical challenges. You have to look at someone's schedule and then send emails back and forth and figure a time when you could just pop your head in before. And I like the idea of going back to, asynchronous things or phone calls or moments where we can dial back a little bit and make things a little bit more accessible for people. I found that too, in terms of sometimes I'm like, I don't need to, I love you, but I don't need to see your face right now. I can just have a quick phone call and we can get this problem, fixed. And that has been nice too. And particularly when I'm working with co-authors on things or with students, I'll say, hey, if you're working on this project, I'll leave my phone on between these two kind of times. Just call me up if you have a quick question. And I think sounds like a really good thing. I should get back on an IM function, because maybe that would be a useful thing. Thank you. Amy, would you like to share?
Yes, so when I think about this question, how do we engage employees, I tend to go back to the research. I manage a department, so I have 30 or so faculty who report to me and a couple of staff, but I also do research in this area. And what we know is that people are most engaged when they have a chance to make progress on meaningful work. And both of those pieces, both the progress and the meaningful work, got a little complicated at the beginning of the time that we were working from home. We did know we were doing meaningful work, and we all sort of pulled together. And so in some ways that was almost easier. It was all about keep learning, keep teaching. We had that we could surround ourselves with, but we were sometimes removed from the people who benefit from our work, from each other, from the students. And so I did a lot of surveying and then feeding back to the whole group. We heard from students these three things were really important for them to keep learning. And so people could begin to reconnect with that purpose. The making progress was a challenge as well, because we're working from home without our typical tools. As the group has said, it was more difficult to coordinate. So removing roadblocks became my mantra. I tried to remove everybody's roadblocks, but I also got really focused in on keeping not a to-do list, but a done list. Let's celebrate what we've accomplished. And so the done list were the things that got done in that day, that week, or that month that I could just then feed back. Because sometimes it felt like there was so much, we weren't making progress, but we weren't realizing that we were making progress. The whole key to that engagement piece, though, is that people have to be somewhat available, physically and psychologically available. And with the challenges of these times and homeschooling and all of the things that we've been dealing with, I found that we needed to be somewhat realistic about the kinds of meaningful progress we wanted to make. We refocused our performance goals and decided what we weren't going to get done, set some priorities that people felt comfortable with, but then it was just a lot of empathy and grace, because everybody's situation was different than mine. And it was easy to forget that when I was sitting in my home office and thought that everybody's life was working like mine. I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. There wasn't a lot of hands-on parenting that I had to do compared to my colleagues. And so remembering that and putting myself in everyone else's shoes helped me with that empathetic piece.
And I want to say, Amy, as my department chair, I'll say that sort of thing, if you can get feedback from the folks you're leading, can be really, really helpful. And I feel like, not just the perception of voice that I had, that I know I could speak to her and say, here are my concerns, knowing that she would then turn it around and make it more systematic and say, oh, if I'm hearing this from Beth, let me see if I'm hearing this from other people too. And I appreciate that a lot. And so you're trying to find ways to get feedback back from your team, I think can be really, really useful. I think we're all in layers here, right? Like I manage students remotely. We're all managing, many of us are managing and being managed remotely. And I think understanding, that situation that we're all in can be really, really helpful. And I want to move to this next question. You guys had some really great things to say about engagement, but one of the interesting things that came up in our attendees when they were kind of talking about things that were concerning to them was this idea of actually managing performance. So you're talking about messing with kind of rethinking maybe is the best word, performance goals, but there's a lot of management as monitoring, right? If I can't see them, how do I know they're doing what I need them to? How do I know we're making progress towards those goals? And, you hear the word kind of micromanaging, but right? Isn't there some grain of truth to being able to figure out what people are doing and using check-in conversations? Is that micromanaging? Is it not? I think there is some confusion and concern about how we balance those sorts of issues. And so I think maybe I'll go reverse this and kind of start with Amy a little bit about, thinking through how, if you can't see them, how do you know they're doing what they're doing? And how do you get away from this whole micromanaging thing?
Micromanaging has a really negative connotation, and for probably a good reason. When you are monitoring too closely, it doesn't increase productivity, and it can damage trust and that relationship as well. And so I think about micromanaging. I have to get both of my arms on my Zoom screen. I talk with my hands a lot and I am constrained. I think about micromanaging as one end of that continuum. You can go all the way to the other end of the continuum, something we call laissez-faire leadership, or just not being there at all. That's also not effective for your employees. And so I think managing and leading is often about balancing between those two poles so that you get the positive outcomes that you want without the downsides. And that probably means doing some work up front, setting clear expectations, working with your team to determine what realistic timelines are so that everybody's on the same page. And that way, when you're checking in against a plan that was created collaboratively. And you're not checking in on them, but the team is checking in to see how the progress is going. Doing this in short bites, this is kind of the agile project management approach of saying, what's the sprint? What's the little piece that we're going to do right now? Let's set that goal and then let's check in. Allows you to make sure that you are on track. So that, but again, in a very planned way. But I also think it's important that those check-in meetings are two-way communication. And so it's not only you checking to see what the employees have gotten done, but them having a chance to say, here's what I need to be able to get the next piece done. So making that a conversation and a collaboration, I think, keeps you between those two poles of micromanaging or not being there enough at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, and a lot of times there are these sort of implicit ways to manage, right? Like, I don't necessarily, everything I have to adapt on the fly. And this is the place where we've seen a lot of necessary adaptation, as we've moved. But now we're settling into something, and we have performance goals we have to meet. We have things we need to do. And these things are definitely on the minds of folks in chat and things too. Like, how do we do that? And so maybe I can turn to you, Sean, and ask, your perspective on this, on, how do you make sure people are doing their jobs? How do you, is it micromanaging? Is it not? How does that work?
Yeah, so this has come up a few times across my radar screen since we've been working remotely. And generally the question will be something like, if you can't see them, how can you make sure they're doing their jobs? And I would, if comfortable, would respond by saying, how do you know they aren't doing their jobs? I think we maybe erroneously equated their physical presence in the workplace to work actually getting done, but people can both be at work and not be productive in the workplace, but also be at home and be extremely productive. So I think in some ways we have to adjust our way of thinking away from monitoring specific tasks that people are working on, and more to are the right things getting done, even if they're not getting done in an 8 to 5, because a lot of people have found new ways of keeping themselves resilient, partially by kind of mixing up their day, right? So since they're always at home, I'll use myself as an example. I get up, and within the first hour of waking, I get online, I do a little email. And then I take my son to school, and then I come home, my wife and I go for a walk, and then I come back and it's still before 8, and I sit down and I start my day. And so, but then I also, maybe I go refill my coffee upstairs and I throw in a load of laundry. And so there are some of the daily maintenance things that I'm doing that aren't work, but I'm also still very, very productive in the workplace. A couple of the things that I would share is that I don't think most people as a rule want to micromanage. I think it's, most people find it a little tedious. I think they do it out of a worry that things might not be getting done. And I would encourage people to challenge that notion that I have to see it for it to be happening. So creating a safe environment for people, Managing expectations, not the tasks, I think is probably rule number one. Stay on top of that. And as long as the work is getting done, I think you're still in a good place. And that can also be an opportunity for you to have conversations about, it seems like you're really doing a good job staying on top of these projects. Do you have a little bandwidth for something else? And if the answer is yes, great. You can assign more work. And if it's not, then you move on.
Yeah, and Teresa, do you have anything to add to that?
I wanted to just add, because I think with 300 and some people on the line, it's probably a good time to recognize that how we measure work is very dependent on what the work is.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some places you can measure work very, very clearly and very simply. And you're probably, if you're the manager of those kinds of workers, you're not too worried about this question, right? And then there's the rest of us that the work is a little bit more difficult to measure. And so that I just kind of wanted to point that out. So the answers are going to be varied depending on, and it almost comes back to like what I was saying about the office environment. It's kind of like, how did you do it before? And then how can you adapt what you did before for this current environment? For me and for my team, because we don't have quite the opportunity to collaborate as extensively as we did before, we've taken to developing a few more sort of mini deadlines. So the big projects due in 2 months, what do we want to get done in this next 2 weeks? Or we may even set somewhat artificial deadlines just to keep us on target towards that larger project. And that seems to be helping a little bit, even though it's sort of against our style. It's something that's pretty important for us.
But I think you make a good point, right? Like, and this is how we've had to adapt, where a lot of our, how do we set performance goals? How do we measure performance was really set up to be for a lot of us in a face-to-face environment, or, in a different environment than we're in now. Right. And so rethinking that, I think a lot of people have had to rethink, well, what role does availability play in how I measure performance? What role does responsiveness play in how I measure performance? And how can I, like you guys mentioned, switch a little bit to rethink, what are the core components of this project? And how can I allow for things like Sean said, this sort of integration of work and home in different ways, so long as we're on board with the same goals and moving the project forward in a systematic way. And that might mean creating different sorts of deadlines. It might mean creating, like Joe mentioned, kind of these asynchronous check-ins in different ways. It might mean letting go a little bit of our assumptions about how people work, right? Like, because everybody, I think, works very different depending on the environment they're in. You can control that environment. Like Teresa said, when you're in a work environment, you can control how things are, how we interact, who we see. You can't control people's home life, right? And so allowing, like Amy said, some grace in that, and trying to rethink, well, what's my role, and finding how to get the best, how to engage employees and get the best out of them that I can, while acknowledging that, like Amy said, everybody's situation is different from mine, and that's hard, I think.
I would add one more thing to that, Beth. If we will allow ourselves to rethink, so for example, I think that in many ways, people working remotely has actually accelerated productivity for a lot of people, because what they do is they adjust their work schedule to accommodate when they're at their peak. So people that, if they want to start at 6 a.m. and just jam through a bunch of work before noon, and then they kind of knock off for a couple hours because they want to spend some time with family and the kids are home and they're trying to help with schooling, and then they turn back on at 4 and work till 10. If that's not causing an egregious disruption to the rest of the team's work or the department's work, so much the better, because they're actually getting more done and probably better stuff, more creative stuff done in that time frame. So I think if we can allow ourselves a little grace too, and departmentally grace to allow for flexibility in the work environment, it changes a lot of the landscape for performance.
I would
I
definitely point that, Sean.
Go ahead, Joe, please.
I would definitely plus one that. I have seen that. I have folks that have sort of adjusted their work-life balance to be when they're most productive. And to be honest, my biggest concern has been how to put the brakes on that, right? It's a little concerning to me when I see somebody, making changes at 1 o'clock in the morning. And so it always kind of elicits a conversation. Is everything all right? Is this what you're, no, I had something, early and I was gone most of the day, but I picked this up. And so I definitely agree with that. People have generally adapted, I think, to their most productive times.
Well, Joe, let me piggyback on that a little bit, because my next question is about warning signs, and I think that you kind of bring that up a little bit, which is, what can you be on the lookout? Like, what are the things that provide some red flags to you to notice that someone is struggling? You know, and how do you manage that, and when do you intervene? Because that can be hard if you're walking around, you know, if someone's late every day, if someone is, you know, struggling to get stuff done and they're in there, you can see it. You can try to gauge, those of us who like to be more emotionally intelligent, right? I'm trying to gauge how people are reacting. I can get my eyes on your face. I can get a sense for how you're doing, new hires, et cetera. You know, what do you do? Like, how do you manage warning signs?
I think, I mean, I think there are certainly warning signs. The approach I took was actually more to create a space where people would share those things more readily. So I mentioned the micro polls. So that was sort of a way to start conversations that we would have as a group, or even in one-on-ones, where I could get people to feel more comfortable about sharing where they were at. I think that a lot of times I sort of, to kind of get a sense of where people I was working with were at, I just asked myself. I'm very different from most of my staff. You know, I have middle-aged children at home, I would say, and not all my staff do, but I have a spouse that works in healthcare. I have staff that work in healthcare. I have staff that have spouses that are in education. And so while I might not have the exact same situation, it's similar. You know, the storm impacted all of us in one way or another. And then also kind of reaching out to my network of friends and colleagues at the U, and kind of hearing these things and just floating these events or topics as a group, kind of, I think, brought comfort to people. So either as a group, people would share what their feelings were, or individually, you know, something more would come out. I mean, I think sometimes you have to guess. I think one of the things that was really helpful is I looked at my staff's vacation and sick leave over the last 3 years, and during the 6-month period that we were away. So I think I did it roughly between March and August, and saw that we were, even though our group was larger, we had taken a significantly lower amount of vacation this year than we had in the past, which is not surprising, but I knew people in my group that had canceled vacation. I knew people in my group that liked to travel. And I shared this finding with them, said, you know, look, I know that a lot of you like to take vacation. This is a prime time of year. I'm worried, you know, and then I took 2 days off and sort of modeled, like, you know what, I know you don't feel you can go anywhere. I know you don't feel you can do anything, or maybe you don't feel you can. And I just did it. And I saw people start to take vacation. So some of it is just a guess. It's like, is this going to help people?
I love that, like using the data you have available to you, and then, you know, checking in with yourself and role modeling those sorts of behaviors. I think things that we can all do, right? Is, you know, use yourself as a touchstone, gather data to kind of run it past to see whether that's a reasonable, you know, position to take, and then role model the behaviors that you think would best help struggling employees. I think are good things to look at. You know, it's a hard situation to be in, I think, to manage that. Teresa, Marcus, either of you have things you'd like to share about checking in with struggling folks on your teams?
I think just to go back with Joe as well is the role modeling and modeling behaviors. So what I like to start off, I have a small staff, admittedly, but our staff meeting is, I'll just share how I'm feeling for that day, whether it's positive or negative, and then just approach it with, you know, I'm feeling this way, you know, how are you doing today? Or how was your weekend? Or things like that. Just modeling that behavior of sharing and being open, I think creates trust, so that you can be able to more readily see those red flags if they're showing up.
It was interesting to hear you say that, Marcus, because I was thinking about early on, I think we did a few, they were more verbal polls. I hadn't thought of the Zoom polls. I wish I thought of that. But like, what do you love about working from home and what do you hate about working from home? And when Marcus was talking, it dawned on me that when we did the what do I hate, we found some of the office setup and technology things that were wrong, right? So that question, I was not necessarily thinking about that piece of it, but you know, I hate my back hurting all the time or something like that. leads to things that could really turn into problem solving and things that you might want to do differently, or equipment needed or things like that. So that's sort of what's working, what's not working, what do I love, what do I hate. But it really is about role modeling from my perspective as well. I too will say, I remember, I tell my staff this all the time, but I remember in April or something, they canceled the Freedom Fest and 4th of July. And I said, oh, come on. This isn't going to still be going on 4th of July, right? And now we're talking about Christmas, and it's like, whoa. So
I mean,
reacting to those openly. What's that?
Yeah, but that's where we are right now, right? Is that,
right.
You know, where we kind of felt at the beginning that this is a crisis, and then now we're in this sort of, you know, interesting mode about trying to figure out what comes next. And, you know, one of you and in our attendees said, you know, our team started out strong. Those are your exact words. But as the pandemic continued and the need to work remotely continued, motivation and remaining connected is a struggle. And I think that encompassed so many people's concerns, which is we were all rally around the flag at the beginning, and now what? And, you know, I think I want us, before we move to answering a couple of your questions in chat, I want to, you know, have every one of the panelists respond to this, because I think it's important, which is with everything that has been going on, you know, I hate to say unprecedented time. I feel like I want to get back to precedented from unprecedented. Can we get back to precedented times? But, what changes have you made in your approach to staying connected? You know, what has helped over this time period? What hasn't helped? What are your small wins, your big wins? You know, kind of just framing this all up. And maybe I'll start with Amy here to kind of talk about that.
Yes, the first thing I thought when I saw this question was, yes, this resonated so much with me. I think that the beginning in March, when we all moved to work from home, it was hard. We were trying to figure things out and struggling, yet people do kind of pull together, and there was a sense of novelty, right? There's, okay, we're going to do this. And for a short time, we had a plan of how to do that. It's when things started stretching out across the summer months where I saw the same kind of shift in my team toward lack of energy and just real burnout that I saw. I think this issue of taking leave is important, because if you're able to do that from time to time, you can rebuild. But I also think it's just important as managers to recognize that your staff probably has different needs at this stage in the pandemic than they did at the beginning. One of the things that we're all trying to do is make sense out of a lot of weak signals. And so as a manager, one of the things you may contribute is kind of helping people sort through that, trying to help them understand the situation or form hypotheses. I have adopted curiosity as my leadership style lately, because I don't know very many of the answers, but I'm very interested in helping people sort of make sense of the signals that we do have around us and focusing on what it is that we can control. I do think it's interesting the way people's needs for information change over the course of a crisis. So early on, Teresa was talking about the need for people just to kind of get the facts, and they wanted clear information. We needed to deliver that to them as a whole. After a few weeks, I think we shifted a little bit. And when we reached this period of burnout, I shifted to telling more positive stories. So doing that and creating more opportunities for connection. Because we know, again, making good progress, something positive happening, doing it together sometimes helps to address that burnout. So I think the differences in the way we communicate, and this may shift yet again as we sort of think about, okay, now we're moving into what's next. We may need to mourn a little bit the things that will never be the same, but refocus on a new vision. And so leaders have to kind of walk that path through a crisis, which I think is important. And I do think being really candid and honest is important here. I spent a little bit of time sharing what I knew and a lot of time sharing what I didn't know. And I worked to find out the things that I didn't. But the people who I work with seem to appreciate that. We were all in this together. And so coming to this with an approach of candid information sharing, I think can help people get through this sort of hard middle part of any crisis.
Yeah, I love that, the celebrating the positive things. And we were on a call last week with a number of women, and found out that a number of them had really positive news to share: marriages, citizenship, like things, these positive things that we would normally have celebrated if we were all together. But because everything is so crazy, you kind of, sometimes people feel weird saying, yeah, I have this wonderful thing that I'd like to celebrate, but it just I needed that dose of joy, which was so wonderful. That was facilitated by the leader of that session, because I felt like I needed the joy, like the external sort of things to celebrate as a team, which I thought was really nice. And, Teresa, would you like to add, things that you found work well overall to facilitate this connection?
One of the things that we're really trying to do is to shift back into strategy. So again, we've been working on operations and tactics for a long time and just getting by and getting everything done. And we really want to move back into, actually, Paul put up should we be a brick and mortar store? Well, we're starting to talk about that. Should we be thinking long-term of some kind of a hybrid nature of our work? And I think that, at least maybe for my team, that kind of gets our juices going again. I can't help but bring up the idea of development. I think a lot of people have put their personal and professional development a little bit on hold because they've been so busy with other things. And so as we are in performance review time, we're setting goals. Let's talk about how do we go back into strategy? How do we develop? How do we really kind of wrap that sort of more quality of work back into our plans rather than just trying to get through, if you will.
And I love that idea of how can we continue. You had mentioned kind of the operational sort of stuff before, but also working in those strategic questions, like thinking big and bold and positive again, which we kind of, that creativity, that innovation, that's sometimes needed, right? It makes us feel like we have a common vision, and sometimes you're treading water so much that it's hard that you can let those things go, but it is nice to bring them back in a way to connect on the big questions.
Makes it feel like we're like moving and not, I like that treading water metaphor. It makes it feel like we're making some progress again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Marcus, things to remain connected.
Yeah, so I think just personal well-being is important here, and this might be the time that I interject my ergonomic thoughts on the actual physical workspace that we're working in plays a big role in our well-being and those we supervise. So my initial response to the pandemic was to come home with my teeny laptop and I just plug away, and that's the way I'm going to do it until we reach the end. And now it's very evident we're not reaching the end in the immediate future. So really expanding to provide more comfort for your home work situation is very important as far as avoiding burnout and making the connections. Because if we're not comfortable physically with the way we're working, I don't think psychologically, emotionally, we'll be able to connect readily like we would have in a more comfortable kind of office environment. So I think it's important to set up your workstation for comfort, which in turn will help you emotionally as well as psychologically for the work that's being done and to keep connected to each other.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, it takes one of those levels of stress and consternation away, right? When you're not, toggling between all of your different things and trying to figure it out, when you can connect more seamlessly with people using technology, if you have a technological setup that, is more conducive for your health and well-being. And those are things I think you're right. Like I am still, I'm shamefaced right now, still sitting in my really not great tech setup, because maybe it's that hope in the back of my mind that we'll be going back at some point in time, right? But these are the things that I'm learning, right? Which is don't put off that future comfort. Like it will make your life better in the moment, and you should do that. And yeah, so I'm learning stuff from today, which is great. Joe, would you like to share?
Sure. I think I can add a little bit to what Beth had said, but really it's acknowledging the situation we're in, right? So there is still a lot of change happening. Seems like every month there's some sort of new thing that we discuss, and I think acknowledging that and discussing it helps. While we want to go back to normal, things are still not normal. Another director in ITS had a conversation with her staff about accomplishments, and I ran a conversation with my team at our last meeting about, I just asked everyone to spend a couple of minutes and think about things that they were proud of, either themselves or that we had done as a team. And I was amazed. And I mean, I knew that I would get good engagement, but it was 10 times more than I expected. We had our students providing things that they were really happy and proud about. A new staff member who's been here a month. And it was one of these sort of feel-good sessions where everybody said something, and a lot of people said things that surprised me. They weren't things that I felt they would say because I didn't know how important it was to them. And it really, again, it sort of opened up more conversation. You know, we are talking about eval time, but that wasn't really how I framed it. I really framed it as, you know, how do we continue to move through this? And don't think about the things that haven't happened or haven't happened as quickly as we would like. Let's talk about what really did work. And that was actually pretty amazing. And I reached back out to that person and said, I'm glad you mentioned this because this was really useful and impactful. So
awesome. Ideas that you can put into play right there, like that. Great.
Can I bring up and tie back to what Marcus was saying and something you said earlier, Joe, is bringing back up that idea of walking meetings. So we have really focused on turning on our cameras and trying to connect with one another. But a really great strategy from a health and well-being perspective also has been to just pick up the cell phone and walk, right? Walk outside or do whatever. And maybe we don't get to see each other that time, but we're moving and we're doing something a little bit different. So again, this is the long haul. So how can you be creative about the way that you do the work and the technology you use and the supports that you have? We had a meeting of our large HR group, the whole distributed model. And somebody said something in one of the meetings where, yeah, I've learned all this wellness stuff, but that's for me to teach our employees. You know, we don't do a good job of doing it ourselves, either as a manager or as an HR rep or whoever we might be. And so really taking actual time in the meeting to stand up and stretch, or Marcus has some great exercises that you can do to
share exercises. Yes.
Yeah. Do them right then and there so that people feel the permission to do them. Should we go? No.
You can feel free to use my website and share with your staff. That's great.
Yeah, Marcus, put that in the chat, will you, for everybody? That'd be great. Thanks. And Sean, would you like to finish off this question before we move to some really wonderful panelist questions in chat?
Sure. I'll just throw in a couple of things to piggyback on what Teresa was saying. You know, one thing that our leadership has made a priority is well-being. And so several meetings each week, we have folks from our Live Well team or EAP or Ergonomics spend 5 to 7 minutes teaching us something or engaging us in a physical activity. So recently it was with the little foam rollers, you know, some things that you can do, and you're encouraged to either leave your camera on and do it or turn it off and do it. But we're living what we provide to campus. And I think that's great that we've devoted time in meetings to support that. And perhaps a little tongue in cheek and separate from that is, you know, one of the things that I have to remind myself about, and I remind my staff about, is I think a lot of us got into the work that we're doing now because we like variety. And there's plenty of variety in the work we were doing before COVID, but now it's on turbo. And so it's sort of like we're really getting, I don't even want to say too much of a good thing, because I think we're enjoying it. And if we can focus on the good aspects of the maybe the extra work or the longer hours or the weird schedules or the working from home, I think there is some value. And I'm happy to help people make line of sight connections between the work and how they're feeling. So, you know, a lot of us have learned new skills that we would not have developed, and we've developed them really rapidly. Like, we are darn near Zoom gurus, and not me so much, but my team. They're amazing because they had to be. So it's just some of the stuff that we've gotten to do in hindsight is unbelievable.
And I want to, you know, I want to appreciate that, because I think, you know, there are positive things that are coming out of this. And I think, you know, finding some time to acknowledge those are important. And, you know, we have some really great sharing that's happening in chat and some great questions that have come up. And I'm going to take the last 10 minutes here to answer those. And so I'm going to start with one that I think should be a pretty straightforward question, maybe for Marcus or Teresa, which is about policies about technology, bringing it home. And I want to ask for people who are working, not necessarily that you would be able to talk about policies, but like ways maybe you talk to your manager about those sorts of things and what you might ask for and what you think might be most important. But also, you know, mixing that in with what if you work part-time from home? So one of the questioners asked, you know, hey, this is seeming like a lot of people working full-time from home. Sometimes I have hybrid people who are coming in and not. And I know Amy can talk to this and we'll talk about that just in a moment. But I want to tee up those two questions. Maybe Marcus, first you could ask about what people might ask for, you know, in terms of being the most important things that you think or you might offer. And then maybe we can pivot to asking a little bit about how all of the stuff we've talked about applies to people who are in hybrid situations.
So equipment-wise, kind of policy kind of varies department to department. So it's definitely a conversation you'll want to have with your supervisor about what's appropriate for your department. But traditionally, a lot of home office equipment has been kind of out of pocket from the employee. So what I've developed is kind of a cost-effective list of some of the most common things that might be required to set up your home office. And that's in the link I provided up there with the remote work ergonomic toolkit. So at the very bottom, there's a list that you can go through that has, again, some of the most cost-effective, easiest ways to address your situation, from like a laptop stand, which I now have, to just lumbar supports and footrests, things that don't cost a whole lot of money but can have a big impact on the way that you feel when you're working. So I do encourage people to go through that. And then I'm also available to do assessments. I've been doing those virtually. If people want to set those up, you can find that through the Ergonomics website as well, that we can work one-on-one to try to better set up your home work environment for you.
I love that idea, because I feel like with ergonomics, and you guys are the ergonomics experts, of course, but it's one of those things that you don't realize how bad you are until it's really bad. And so trying to intervene early on before you're not only dealing with remote work and COVID and everything else that's going on, but you're also dealing with persistent back or neck pain because you've been sitting on the couch on your tiny laptop. So yeah, I like the idea. So thank you, Marcus, for providing those links. I hope everybody got them, and we'll make sure we make them available to everybody too if you're scrolling through to find them. Thank you. And so obviously the home office thing applies whether you're working full-time from home or hybrid from home, right? Because you're going to need certain components. But a lot of the things we've been talking about, whether your whole team is remote or certain components, like Teresa, you brought up, it depends on the work, right? Like some of these things are depending on the work that you're doing. Well, the same for hybrid versus not. And so I don't know, I know for sure Amy is leading people who are some on site and some not, but maybe who would like to kind of respond to that?
So I can talk briefly and then I might pass it to someone else. I do think it's important when you think about people in different situations not to create this sense of a fault line or a break between those two groups. And so to the extent that you can have interactions that are the same for everyone, no matter whether they're remote or in the office. So having everyone log into a Zoom meeting, even though some people may be right down the hall from each other, helps you not disadvantage the people who are at home. I also think it's good to recognize and be empathetic to the point that not everyone is where they would choose to be if they had full choice. And so some of this issue of managing people who are remote or who are in the office is about helping them feel comfortable with the situation that they're in, and recognizing that that may be a decision that wasn't what they would have thought was ideal for them. I have some people who would love to stay at home they can see working from home forever, and others who really want to be in the office. And I think we all have strong preferences about that. And the policies are often more about making sure people are safe and essential work is getting done than they are about people's preferences right now. And so this is another place where I've just tried to show some empathy.
Teresa, did you have anything you were going to add? I thought you were about to.
It was exactly what Amy said. It sort of sounds obvious now because some of us have been doing it for a while, but just making sure that we are all the same, even if some are hybrid and some are fully remote and some are fully there. The idea of, that was another aha moment for me, that, oh, even when I go back to the office, I'm going to have to log in and do Zoom meetings. What? well, it's only fair and it's only equitable, and it would not be right for me to be meeting with people or in the office when others are at home. So I just think that that's really, really critical. We've been trying to kind of focus in on, for our hybrid workers, you know, what is the most important technology that you need to be able to get back and forth quickly and easily, right? Or do you have to be hybrid? So we have a number of people that took their whole desktop home, right? So that they could be working. Those people are not going to be able to take that desktop back and forth once a week or every other week or any sort of thing like that. So again, that flexibility around what technology are you using? Can we afford some kind of a upgrade or an ability to make it more, better? And if it's not, is it okay that those folks remain remote? Does that make sense? So we make those decisions based on a variety of factors.
And I think coming up in the chat, you know, that seems to be an issue with how do you, a lot of things, I think, how do you create fairness? And it is on us, I think, as managers to make sure that we're, you know, you brought up kind of fairness and equity and like making sure, you know, Amy, I heard you talk about autonomy, right? Like choice. You know, being a professor and researching these stuff, I always like to find those mechanisms, because I think, you know, policies, you can figure out which policies work best if you know what problem you're actually trying to solve. Like, do people feel like they've been forced into something, they don't have choice? Do people feel like they don't have flexibility? And, you know, one of the questions brought up was, what if you have a customer service facing job and you have to be, you're student facing, right? You have to be in the office or available between these specific hours. Like, how do you give people choice in those situations? Like, how do you help them? And, you know, I think that's where creativity comes in. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add on how they have tried to manage those more time or task dependent sorts of positions. I know they're different and they vary. Thoughts about that? Hard. I think that's a hard question, to kind of figure out, how do you grant flexibility to something that feels not flexible?
Yeah.
Right? Or how do you grant autonomy to something that feels like you have no choice? How do you
And
create?
it may be more of a structural change for those roles. And so we've talked a lot about job sharing. And if someone really does need a significant portion of time to homeschool their children and they have a role that requires the 8 to 5, we may have to do something that's more a restructuring of that role. Then for people who can, I can do my work almost any time of night. So the 1 a.m. email from me means that I took a few hours off during the day to do something that needed doing. Not everybody has a job that does that well. And so those jobs may need restructuring if someone needs that time.
Yeah, and those are the structural things are hard. We're coming right up on time. We have had a lot of people share. There's so many more questions. I mean, we could have done this, and hopefully we'll be able to do another one where we're able to address some of these issues that have come up, and other, you know, expect to hear from us. And, you know, I know, Diane, you've put this up. Do you have final words you'd like to share? I want to thank our panelists, of course, but Diane, do you have final comments here?
Great discussion. Again, thank you, our panelists. I realize this is just the start of a conversation. We're in a situation which is going to continue, and I think how we work is going to evolve and change. And so we're always interested in looking at solutions with the focus on worker well-being. Feel free to reach out to Beth or I. Some of you were concerned because you had to leave early, but we can send the link out. And if you haven't gotten enough, on the 27th, we'll be holding another panel like this, but it will be outside of the University of Iowa with employers, and we can send you that. And the last is the link on the bottom is to the reports about the surveys that we have done, and those will start being put up on that site as we get through the data. But again, thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.